So, good morning to those calling in from the United States, and good evening to anyone who's joining us from Asia. We're very happy that you can join us for today's discussion on the role of philanthropies and non-government organizations in driving reconciliation and addressing war legacies. We're going to give everyone a minute to come in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started with the substantive discussion. So please hang tight for just a minute. All right, it looks like we're seeing a slowdown in the trickle of people moving over from the waiting room. So, to everyone who's joining us today, thank you. Good morning and good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. We're delighted to have you here for today's discussion on the importance of philanthropies and NGOs in addressing war legacies and reconciliation. For those I don't know, my name is Courtney Weatherby. I'm the Deputy Director for the Stimson Center's Southeast Asia program, and I'm really honored to introduce today's discussion. The Stimson Center has been lucky enough to host the War Legacies Working Group for years, bringing together a range of organizations working on the ground in Vietnam and across Southeast Asia, as well as in the United States, to address issues related to unexploded ordnance, Agent Orange, and mine clearance in the broad theater of the Vietnam War. So as many of you know, when the shooting ended in 1975, that was the end of the active war, but it was not the end of the impacts of the war. Families on many sides of the conflict still seek resolution to the painful loss and uncertainty surrounding those who went missing in action. Unexploded ordnance, bombs, missiles, grenades, and other munitions that did not detonate when they were used can still explode when disturbed and remain scattered throughout the region. And the legacy of Agent Orange and other dioxin-based herbicides used to clear foliage during the war continue to impact local hotspots, as well as tens of thousands of people who are born with disabilities. So this year, 2025, marked 50 years after the end of the war in Vietnam, and efforts to address the legacies of war have become the cornerstone of the U.S. relationship with Vietnam. This was very publicly acknowledged in 2023 when our two countries formed a comprehensive strategic partnership. But I think it's important to look back at history and recognize that that partnership was not inevitable. It took decades of dedicated work from a very broad range of actors to reconcile and forge a forward-looking partnership through addressing those legacies of the past. So while the U.S. government had engaged through unofficial channels for nearly 2 decades prior to resuming diplomatic relations on the issue of Americans missing in Vietnam, it took far longer to direct resources and attention to the other ongoing impacts from the war that I talked about, particularly UXO and dioxin. It wasn't really until 1989 that direct rehabilitation support was available for UXO survivors through the Leahy War Victims Fund, and even after broader tranches of humanitarian assistance were passed, it wasn't until 2010 that disabilities and health issues related to Agent Orange and dioxin were directly referenced in the funding bills. So on all of these issues, attention, support, and engagement by non-government and philanthropic organizations was crucial. And in fact, non-government assistance from groups like Ford Foundation and others significantly outpaced congressional assistance up until 2010, and they were vital in helping draw attention and support to these issues and other necessary efforts to support reconciliation. So with that context out there, I'm very happy to welcome Ambassador Karen Stewart, who retired this year as a career member of the Foreign Service after nearly 50 years of service with the Department of State. She was appointed as ambassador 3 times in Belarus, Laos, and the Marshall Islands. And after retiring, she joined the board of the non-governmental organization Legacies of War to raise awareness and support for clearing unexploded ordnance. Her full bio is on the event page for anyone who wants to see it. But Ambassador Stewart, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm delighted to turn things over to you for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Courtney. It's certainly my honor and pleasure to provide a few opening remarks before this panel considers the role of foundations and what we diplomats broadly call civil society in encouraging and supporting reconciliation between the former enemies and through addressing the legacies of war. The lasting legacies of war, slowly at first, as you pointed out, Courtney, and growing, that these efforts have not only saved lives and supported vulnerable communities, but that's also bolstered the years of diplomatic progress that we can see in Southeast Asia. Foreign aid in this context, I would say, is not charity, it's a strategic investment for our country. The U.S. assistance in Southeast Asia has consistently garnered bipartisan support due to its clear, tangible benefits, enhanced safety, economic stability, and strengthened bilateral cooperation. As our experience in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia shows, strategic use of foreign aid not only saves lives, as I've said, but also helps the post-conflict nations develop and become less reliant on foreign aid in the future and over the long run. It fosters the reconciliation that has led to these comprehensive partnerships and that allows the U.S. to work with our new friends in Southeast Asia to expand collaboration on many other fronts, whether that be economic cooperation, people to people, education, defense, the whole realm of a normal and growing and friendly bilateral relationship that we'd want to see. But looking back at my own experience in Laos, how did this reconciliation begin for the U.S. in Southeast Asia? When I first served in Laos in the mid-1980s, the U.S. government was treated, very understandably, in that first decade after the war, with suspicion and a great deal of caution, if not outright hostility. At least in Laos, we had managed to maintain a small embassy after the war, but we had very limited access to the Lao government and to the people. And in Vietnam and Cambodia, we did not even have that degree of official relations until some years later. The policies and contacts that opened the door to reconciliation in those early days were largely due to private non-government organizations, such as the National League of Families of American POW MIAs, who worked very closely with the U.S. government and the U.S. embassies, and the people-to-people ties in the humanitarian programs out in the field of private groups, such as the Quakers, the Mennonites, who had actually more ability and access to get outside the capital and actually help the Lao people, in my experience, very directly. Later, of course, as our relationships have developed and as those countries have opened out outsiders, we see this growing role and presence and contributions from foundations and other non-government organizations, including the organization that I'm now involved with, Legacies of War, and the War Legacies Project, who work in advocacy and education efforts. Going back again to my time, all of my time in Laos, my 3 different times, but particularly in the early times, the first priority was our recovery of the Americans missing in action. And in 1985, well before we upgraded relations with Laos to the ambassadorial level, the Lao government made its initial humanitarian gesture of allowing us to send our first investigative team to Pak Se, Laos, to recover remains from a 1972 plane crash. This was politically supported by the League of Families, and with that political support, the U.S. made its own gesture of goodwill by supplying rice during a bad drought year. As a personal aside, that food donation resulted in my first personal encounter with UXO, as I was taken to Sin Quang to observe the food aid distribution and cautiously walked around Bombeys on the plain of jars. Later, as U.S. ambassador, I had the more satisfying experience of safely detonating collections of those cluster munitions that had been cleared from agricultural land. This collaboration on the humanitarian mission of recovering our missing in action laid the foundation for addressing the complex challenges of UXO and Agent Orange, which were priority concerns of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It's not been an easy process, but great strides have been made to address the impacts of at least 13 million tons of explosive remnants of war that litter the countryside, and that have 200,000 casualties since the end of the war in all 3 of the countries. In 1989, USAID launched its first post-war humanitarian initiative through the Leahy War Victims Fund, providing prosthetics to former veterans of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and civilians who had been injured. In 1993, the U.S. expanded its efforts, funding clearance teams for humanitarian demining to remove landmines and unexploded ordnance from villages in all the 3 countries of Southeast Indochina. This cleared land for essential infrastructure, as I have seen in farmland and schools, homes, and hospitals. Learning that nearly half of the casualties of UXO accidents were children, USAID and the State Department also began funding educational programs in schools to teach children not to touch, not to handle the UXO, and to alert an adult for proper expert clearance. We've seen that these mine action efforts led to a dramatic reduction in the number of casualties. In Laos, casualties went from 300 per year to 60 or fewer over the past decade, but sadly not to zero. Only in recent weeks, we've had the case of 5 boys, one killed, I believe, and others maimed from UXO. And so, this process, this is a legacy and that needs to still be addressed. Reconcile, we have with the Congress providing the funding, we have recognized the necessity and benefit of such investments, not only in Southeast Asia, but in more than 125 countries, where the U.S. globally has been the largest provider of humanitarian demining assistance, investing over $5 billion so far. Of this amount, about $700 million has been allocated for Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The other deeply contentious issue between the U.S. and Vietnam, as Courtney has noted, has been Agent Orange. But it has managed to evolve over time into a shared area of collaboration where we have been able to make some real progress in addressing the effects. The U.S. has invested in dioxin remediation at former military bases, as well as funding medical care and rehabilitation for thousands of Vietnamese with severe disabilities who were living in areas where there was dioxin contamination where the herbicides were used. We had similar initiatives with funding spearheaded by Senator Leahy, former Senator Leahy, begun in Laos. Unfortunately, with the aid freeze earlier this year, those efforts in Laos have been halted, which tragically leaves us a generation of children with birth defects and disabilities without the very critical support they need. So others here on this panel are more experienced with developments in Vietnam than I am, but I can witness to the fruits of reconciliation and trust building from these humanitarian programs over the last 40 years since I was first posted to the U.S. Embassy Vientiane. This progress owes much to the work of non-government organizations directly in Southeast Asia and back here in Washington on Capitol Hill and with the executive branch to keep a focus on the importance of this work. The work of reconciliation is not finished, however, and I look forward to the insights from this panel on the role of foundations and other civil society elements in supporting and furthering the efforts in Southeast Asia and wherever the wounds of war persist. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Stewart, for those personal insights from your time in Vientiane. I think it's an important reminder, as you highlighted, that the U.S. has been active with humanitarian assistance in over 100 countries, that this is, we're talking about lessons learned from the theater of war in Southeast Asia, but that this is an ongoing challenge. We've had much more recent conflicts, which 50 years from now may have similar conversations like the one we are having about what has been addressed and what is still needed to be addressed. So with that context, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our session moderator for today, Susan Hammond. She's the founder and executive director of the War Legacies Project. She's also just recently returned from on-the-ground engagements in the region and may be able to draw on some insights into how things are being talked about there on this 50th anniversary. But Susan, I look forward to hearing from this discussion what comes out about potential lessons learned that can be shared, not only for continued efforts in this space in Southeast Asia, but farther afield as well.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Ambassador Stewart, for your opening remarks. It's been wonderful working with you over the years and with many of the other ambassadors in the region. Before we begin our panel discussion, I would like to acknowledge a few foundations that have been instrumental in the work fostering peace and reconciliation in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and helping to mitigate the impacts of the war. First is the Chino Cienega Foundation that not only has funded Stimson, including the War Legacies Working Group, but they've also supported the work of many others, including my organization, to raise awareness about the impacts of the war and to advocate for the U.S. to address the impacts. Particularly, a few American foundations would touch this sensitive subject in the late 90s and early 2000s. Their ongoing support is greatly appreciated. I would also like to acknowledge the Samuel Rubin Foundation. Sadly, we learned of the passing of Cora Weiss earlier this week on the 100th birthday of her husband, Peter, who died earlier in November. We could spend the whole panel talking about the role Cora played in funding efforts to end the war, to raise awareness about the impacts of the war on the civilian populations, and after the war to support the efforts to address the legacies and foster reconciliation. May they both rest peacefully and their memories be a blessing. We are honored today to have three panelists whose work has been vital in supporting efforts for reconciliation between the people of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia and the United States, and to help mitigate the impacts of the war on its land and the people. I will not repeat their bios, so please check those out for yourself in the program description. My first trip to the region was in 1991. The impacts of the war on the people and the environment were very visible. At the time, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam were among the poorest in the world. Today, Vietnam and Cambodia are middle-income countries, and both are aiming to become upper middle-income countries by 2030. Meanwhile, Laos aims to graduate from the least developed country status in November of next year. One important factor in post-war development has been the role of foundations, including those we'll hear more about today. The Ford Foundation was essential in funding people-to-people engagement on among many other efforts in post-war Vietnam. Many of its program participants who came to the U.S. from Vietnam for educational exchanges over the years are now leaders in the Vietnam government. Without the significant financial resources from Ford that funded scientific research on dioxin hotspots in Vietnam at former U.S. military bases, as well as the advocacy efforts of organizations like my own, it is likely that the U.S. and Vietnam would not be where we are today addressing the impacts of Agent Orange. Susan Beresford was vital to this effort, and we look forward to hearing from her. Welcome, Susan. The Henry Luce Foundation also helped to facilitate countless educational and people-to-people exchanges with Southeast Asia, helping to build trust and understanding between former enemies. We'll hear from Terry Lautz, the former Vice President and Program Director at East and Southeast Asia, about these and other efforts at Luce, including helping Americans understand the Southeast Asia region. Welcome, Terry. Not only is it 50 years at the end of the Vietnam War, but it's been 30 years since Vietnam and the U.S. normalized relations. Over those years, perhaps the one person who has been the object of much of our advocacy has been Tim Reeser, who, as the aide to Senator Leahy and staff on the Foreign Appropriations Committee, has been instrumental in turning the advocacy work of so many of us to get the U.S. to address the impacts of the war in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia into funding programs from the U.S. by the U.S. government. We would not be here today on any of the unexploded ordnance Agent Orange issues if it wasn't for Tim. So welcome, Tim. As I flew out of Tan Son yesterday morning, the sight of the skyscrapers, the new highways, factories, and the urban sprawl would make one think that the impacts of the war are long over. But there's much more that needs to be done. As Ambassador Stewart mentioned, there were 5 children impacted by an unexploded ordnance just a few weeks ago as they were looking for crabs not too far from their home. The last I heard, there was not a fatality, but one young boy lost his eyesight and another lost a limb. But they will have decades and decades of rehabilitation that will be needed, and the trauma from that impact will be ongoing. As we listen to the experiences and the lessons learned from those who have been addressing the impacts of war that has been over for 50 years, there's much that can be learned that is, as Courtney mentioned, can be applicable to current wars and the long process of reconciliation and the efforts to mitigate the legacies. So we look forward to hearing from our panelists today. And Terry, Susan Beresford, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Now, the Ford Foundation entered the field of Agent Orange dioxin because it was something Vietnam wanted, but from which the US government had shied away. And sometimes I think that's just where philanthropy belongs. Philanthropy can take up a sensitive problem, provide money in partnership. It doesn't always solve the problem, but it can model a way of working and making progress. And I think that's because we have to remember philanthropy is very free. It has its own money and staff, it can move easily, it can consult widely and respond quickly. And there are no election year or bottom line pressures, and it can stick with a problem for decades. Well, in 1990, the Vietnamese invited work there, and this led to the opening of an office in Hanoi in 1996 for the Ford Foundation. But as a first step, before we could really get underway, in 1993, we tracked down all the Vietnamese staff or their families from an office we had earlier had in Saigon. And we paid them 18 years of back pay and severance. And we saw this as a gesture of respect and gratitude, and essentially in a relationship of trust we wanted between ourselves and the Vietnamese government. Key to the rest of the story is someone named Charles Bailey, who I think you all know very well, who I invited to head the Hanoi office in 1997. The Vietnamese had shown me the suffering and pain of Agent Orange dioxin, but it wasn't clear to me at first how we could embrace a topic that had such bitterness around it and such controversy. But in 2000, when Charles believed we could get started, I told him he was free to follow his instinct, do whatever he thought was useful, collaborate with others, work with the Vietnamese and the US government as much as possible, and that he had my full support and the full support of our trustees at the foundation. And Charles has skill, as you all know. But others in the nonprofit community were already doing a lot of work, as several people have already noted, Vietnamese Americans, Mennonites, Quakers, US vets, and others. And so we first wanted to just engage in some simple way. And so we made a grant to the Vietnamese Red Cross, and they used it for direct services to AO victims in the 3 southern provinces. And we watched that grant and we learned a lot from it. But soon we came to believe that there was one of the reasons the US government had avoided Agent Orange problems was a belief that dioxin had affected the entire geography of the South. And for some decision makers, it seemed like too big a problem. So there was one early Ford grant to a Vietnamese-Canadian project to identify hotspots that had to be addressed right away. And I think that helped to sideline for a while the disputes over the science of birth defects and get on to real urgency of cleanup. And soon the foundation was funding work to focus the 2 governments on one hotspot in Da Nang. Other Ford grants piloted projects to help Agent Orange victims and their families. These were often obviously very low income families with children with very, very severe disabilities. And we began to engage with Vietnam's leading environmental specialist, Professor Vo Quy, to see what might be done about the damaged landscapes. Over the 12 years at Ford Orange, we made 78 grants totaling $17.1 million. We concentrated on 3 areas. The first was assisting Vietnamese with severe disabilities in heavily sprayed areas. They were mostly Agent Orange victims. The second was helping launch cleanup in the 2 largest hotspots and reducing the dioxin threat to people around those hotspots. And third was seeking to build US public opinion that would encourage our government to address Agent Orange. We hope to show that work on these problems could be done with Vietnamese partners, not just through American organizations. And we tried to bring in other philanthropic donors and show that people could work across these war divides. We also created a Track 2 process that had the long name, the US-Vietnam Dialogue Group on Agent Orange Dioxin in Vietnam, too long a name. We invited Walter Isaacson, who was then president of the Aspen Institute, and Madame Tonu T. Ning, who was vice chair of the National Assembly's Foreign Affairs Committee, to be co-chairs of this group. And over the years, they built a group of changing persons of influence in both countries who came to know the issues and know and trust each other. The dialogue group ultimately signed off on a 10-year, $300 million plan of action that could be a resource for people entering the field. And later, Charles and Dr. Legacies wrote a book, which is another resource for the field. But whatever progress we helped bring about was the result of cooperative work with the many organizations and leaders you all know about. We couldn't have made any progress without passionate people like Senator Patrick Leahy, Tim Reeser, Ka Van Tran, Bobby Mueller, Dr. Legacies' son, Madam Ning, Walter Isaacson, Ngole Mai, Bo Wang Ian, Susan Hammond, of course, Andrew Wells Dang, and Sally Benson and Steve Nichols of the Chino Siniega Foundation. So there are a lot of actors that we were part of a group with. But we did encounter some frustration. Some government people in the US just ignored us or asked skeptically how we could work with or trust communists and their organizations. One State Department official we talked with warned that we would make no progress until we framed the Agent Orange solutions as something beautiful. We couldn't understand what he was saying. So we asked him, and he talked about an example in the Pacific Island where they were making cutlery out of unexploded ordnance and selling them. And he said they made a beautiful movie about it, and we ought to do the same kind of thing. Charles and I left the meeting sort of scratching our heads and wondering what this was really about. But we did have good relations with most of the US ambassadors to Vietnam. They saw the problem up close and really wanted to help. They and other open-minded officials kept asking us, though, if we do what you ask, when will be enough? What is enough? And I have to admit, we didn't have a very good answer for that. I think that's an issue we should turn to. Equally frustrating was some Vietnamese officials' reluctance to strongly press the US government for help on Agent Orange. They were negotiating a new bilateral relationship, and obviously trade triumphed over healthcare and disability experience. We kept explaining to them that the US is a demand system in a way. If you don't have a specific ask, you're not going to get. But that really went nowhere. Despite this frustration, when I stepped back, and this really echoes something that's already been said, I believe the work we all did together really helped get the US more engaged than would have been the case if we'd done nothing or half of what we'd done. And I think that's very important to remember, because small changes can have very big consequences. And just taking a Ford example, we made grants totaling 17.1 million for this problem. And I don't know what the sum is of what the others put in that were like us, but it is sure to me that our combined funds are now hugely outweighed by the $543 million the US government has put in. So small moves can make a big difference. And philanthropy is only one small part of the larger not-for-profit community, but it does have this patient money given to nonprofit organizations, and it can pioneer with courageous and dedicated leaders like those who we've been talking about. In those nonprofit organizations, people gather and mobilize about issues that disturb them. And if you think about it, almost every successful reform movement in the US begins at a local level in nonprofit organizations. And they together work to build momentum until government can't ignore them any longer. And in a democracy, this momentum is crucial. So what can be done now to reignite the sympathy and passion and feeling of war legacies, or boost it some while we're here today? And I think if the past is prologue, we need to build again local and state activism and engagement, and we need new philanthropic partners. We are just seeing some resumption of government funding for war legacies that had been stalled for a while. But under the current administration, I think a new and national commitment in a humanitarian spirit is a remote possibility. So I think new thinking needs to be done about where sympathy and passionate feelings now lie. I think the conclusions we relied on may be out of date and unhelpful. And perhaps there would be value in linking more recent war legacy matters, such as those in Ukraine or some of the other war areas, with the older ones in Vietnam. There certainly are going to be people concerned with that. And I suspect we need new data about remaining challenges and a reframing. And I think maybe local philanthropies are a place to start where they weren't really before. I think there may be clusters of Vietnamese Americans who now have local power and access to local foundations. There may be leaders at local levels in the US that have now seen American or Vietnamese relatives suffer and even die from AOD poisoning. And there may be people who just want to help right a wrong. It is possible that these solutions of activism and these sources of activism may be quite different from the ones we relied on before. And then finally, I would say, I think it's hard always, and we have to remember this, to declare victory in long-term struggles. If you think of struggles like the effort to destroy apartheid and its effects, or to build really effective human rights systems, or to address painful war legacies, it's really hard to declare victory totally. But the point I think we're here to talk about is that nonprofits, including foundations, can get things started and restarted, and they can project an issue against strong headwinds, and they can save lives. That's really important. And I hope our society never clips those wings, and I hope we can all continue to work together on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Your point on local NGOs was very important, because I remember I was just visiting the other day with one of the original Ford Foundation recipients, the DRD, which now goes by the name Life is Beautiful, that has been providing support for people with disabilities throughout Vietnam, but particularly in the South, who have been impacted by Agent Orange. And we were lucky to be recipients of very generous New York Times donors when there was a story written in Vietnam earlier this year about aid being eliminated for receive support from DRD. And so I got a chance to see how that $17,000 that came in from everyday Americans who read that story. So Americans really, really care about that, about addressing and helping people who've been impacted by American wars. And thank you, the Ford Foundation, for your efforts in this. Back in the dark days in the late 90s, early 2000s especially, Ford was really that shining light that was forcing us to look at these issues and finding a way that we could work together. So thank you for that. I'm going to switch over to Terry now, who's with was the Southeast Asia director for the Henry Luce Foundation. And so Terry, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thanks to Courtney and Stimson for organizing this. Luce Foundation, as I think Courtney mentioned earlier, focuses more on the U.S. side, and the underlying purpose of the grants that we made for East and Southeast Asia was to increase the American capacity to understand these regions. We did that through a combination of scholarship and exchange, language study, policy studies, but all focused within the humanities and social sciences. So it's been a longer term kind of effort, in contrast to the remarkable work of the Ford Foundation. And Susan Beresford has described so eloquently the philosophy and the ability of American philanthropies, and the freedom that we've had to venture into areas where government and other organizations can't do. So I won't try to repeat that, but let me make a personal note to start with, and that is to express my deep and everlasting appreciation to Andrea Panarides, who continues to work with the Christopher Reynolds Foundation. Small but mighty, and now working as they did on Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, on Cuba relations. But it was in January of 1990 that Andrea invited me for a trip to Vietnam and Cambodia with Stanley Katz, who was president of ACLS, American Council of Learned Societies, and Alberta Arthurs, who was with MacArthur Foundation. And it was just an eye-opening experience for all of us. I remember getting to Hanoi and going out on the streets. I think it was literally January 1st, and people wanted to know where we were from. And with some trepidation, we said we were Americans. And the response was so remarkably positive. And in fact, they even went further to say, we're so glad you are not Russians. The Russians had just left, and they had not apparently behaved all that well. But we went on to Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, and then across the border to Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge had recently evacuated, and UN was just entering. So I'm, as I said, extremely grateful for all of the work that Christopher Reynolds did in those very early days. There have been three parts to the Luce Foundation's funding. One, which may or may not be so familiar to you, is the Luce Scholars Program. And this is a program for year-long fellowships for young American leaders to spend an intensive year with the region. And this was actually started in 1974. And it really was a direct consequence of the realization that the United States needed leaders across a spectrum of professions to understand East and Southeast Asia. Over the years, 73 Luce Scholars have been placed, and it's a program that works in collaboration with the Asia Foundation, which had offices in the region. But over the years, there have been 35 Luce Scholars in Vietnam, 27 in Cambodia, 11 in Laos, and they've worked in civil society, law, medicine, environment, and other fields. And so they don't necessarily become scholars or specialists in these areas, although some of them do. But I think they have a wider impact on understanding, particularly at the local and regional level when they come back to the U.S. Second category are responsive grants. And the total for those grants is $9 million since 1983. Let me mention just a few examples. One was the Aspen Institute's policy discussions between Americans and Vietnamese. That program was led by former Senator Dick Clark. And at that time, it was not possible because of the lack of diplomatic relations to meet in the United States. So the first meeting was in Jamaica. The next one was in Fiji with Vietnamese interlocutors. So this was an example of members of Congress, senators and congressmen, including John Kerry, meeting with Vietnamese counterparts. The Luce Foundation supported Yale's Cambodian genocide program, directed by Ben Kiernan, and this provided important documentation for the genocide trials in Cambodia. The Center for Khmer Studies, which supported exchange and fellowships between Americans and Cambodians. The Journal of Vietnam Studies that was launched by Peter Zinnemann at University of California, Berkeley. And early on, 1995, a grant to the National Gallery of Art in Washington for sculpture of Angkor and Cambodia. So those are just some of the examples. In addition, and then finally, there have been special initiatives, and these have been built around two funds, loose funds for Southeast Asian studies. $8 million in 1987 and $15 million allocated in 2019. And these have gone for rebuilding and reinforcing Southeast Asian studies at U.S. universities. And these universities were they lost the support, particularly government support, for the study of this region in the wake of the Vietnam War. They were casualties of the Vietnam War in some respects. And so these funds went for seed money for new faculty positions, graduate students fellowships, language study, library development. So the hope is that these kinds of grants will have a long-term benefit, and that many of the graduates, many of the beneficiaries then will be working on issues of civil society and issues like environment and so on and so forth. So this focus on education and exchange, and as Susan Beresford has mentioned, building trust, I think it's absolutely what we need for the future. And I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Perry. Yeah, you see the you see the efforts over and over again of the Luce Foundation with the people that you meet at conferences. In fact, I was at the Vietnam conference that the Texas Tech does every year back in April, and at this time, there was so many scholars, Vietnamese American scholars on the region that I know many of them had links to Luce, including some of the language study efforts and all of the support you provided to universities across the U.S. And it's very important as you were able to help make so many Americans understand the region, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos as countries and not just the war, but still also helping to encourage people to work on some of these war legacy issues. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tim Reeser, who's been such a vital part of reconciliation and mitigating the impacts of the war in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. We are grateful for everything that he has done and he continues to do, even though sadly Senator Leahy, who was so vital in this effort, decided to retire, unfortunately. But thank you, Tim. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Susan. Just listening to you all, it just has brought back so many memories for me because I, working for Senator Leahy, was really in a somewhat different position from all of you. But really, and not wanting to repeat what others have said, nothing that Senator Leahy and I did, I think, would have happened had it not been for the efforts of non-governmental organizations, veterans, philanthropic organizations, and others who had been working on these issues long before we ever began. Senator Leahy and I both lived through the Vietnam War period, so we had a personal awareness of the magnitude of that catastrophe on both Vietnam and or rather the countries of Southeast Asia, but also the United States. But we never, at least I never imagined actually being able to do anything about it. We did, over time, come to recognize that, as Courtney said initially, that while the wars were, while the fighting had long since stopped, many of the consequences remained and continued for people and do today. But it was really back in the late 1980s that it was the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation, Bobby Muller and others, who came to Senator Leahy and myself. And that was what really focused our attention on the needs and the lack of any U.S. government action being taken. So as Susan mentioned, it was civil society that was the catalyst here. We were the focus of people's advocacy because Senator Leahy and I had a personal interest, a personal history, and saw the need. But none of that would have happened had all of you and veterans organizations, both advocacy and those who are working on the ground, like Project Renew and others, Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation, and also now Vietnam NGOs, civil society organizations, VAVA and others. We would never have known how to approach these issues had it not been for the advocacy and the work of people like Charles Bailey and Susan Hammond and Susan Beresford and so many others. So I think it's, in some ways, in all my years working in the Senate, probably the best example of where civil society has provided the input, the advocacy, the data, the ideas, the kind of persistence that got us to look at ways of take that advocacy and put it into concrete programs which then the various agencies of the government responsible ultimately undertook to implement. But I think one important thing to remember, and it's really relevant today as we see our own international assistance being cut, is that early on, our own government did not ask for this money. They didn't include it in their own budget. Senator Leahy had to find it in his capacity as chairman of the relevant appropriations subcommittee. I had to find it from other accounts and redirect it to be used for these purposes. So even under early administrations, both Democrat and Republican, it was the Congress that took the initiative, thanks to people like yourselves, and found the money and got USAID and ultimately USIP and the State Department and ultimately the Defense Department, which, like the State Department initially, was very resistant, certainly to doing anything about the issue of Agent Orange. They wanted nothing to do with it. So we had to take the initiative, and that could happen again today, even though we don't have the kind of support that we need from our own government. The breadth of knowledge that we've built over the years and the recognition that the work is far from done, and the fact that all of you are still there and still working and still care enough. There are members of Congress who, I think, even though Senator Leahy is not here, can be informed and convinced that this is something that's important to our relations with these countries. And it's important, obviously, to the people who and their families who are impacted. So I think it would be impossible to overstate the role that advocacy groups and other funders like the foundations mentioned here played in this whole undertaking. But obviously, government ultimately was necessary to put those efforts into practical effect, and to create real programs and ultimately in doing so, I think contribute a great deal to reconciliation and to the ways in which our countries are now cooperating. And so it's had a much broader effect than any of us could have imagined. But we also know that at a time when our own government is pulling back, is really finding other priorities, it really is incumbent on us to remind people up here, and some of them are new and some of them were not even alive during the Vietnam War, why this continues to matter. So I think that, the fact that it was the Congress initially who found the money and got our government to act, thanks to the advocacy of civil society. The Congress is still here. We, believe it or not, are still a separate and equal branch of government. There are people up here who actually do care about that part of the world and understand the need for our engagement and the importance that these programs have. So I would not want people to think that, at this point, there's not a future for the same kind of partnership. Charles Bailey continues to email me on a regular basis, as do many of you. And, we've managed, as Susan mentioned, to restore some of the funding for different programs that had initially been frozen. I'm meeting with a delegation of the Vietnamese military on Sunday to talk about the Vietnam Wartime Accounting Initiative, which is a critically important program to help Vietnam locate its own missing from the war. Thanks to the International Commission on Missing Persons, we've really made some initial progress. So again, it's been a partnership, and it's been people like you who have been able to help me understand how we could use our role here in Washington to really make a difference on the ground. And I think we can still do that. Thank you for including me in this.
Thank you very much, Tim. We're going to move into a few questions here, and just a reminder that there's a Q&A box on your screen down below. So please put any questions you have in there for our panelists, and we will get to as many of them as we can. Wow, a lot of information and fabulous discussions from all of you. I guess one of the questions I have is, and some of you touched upon this already, but I mean, what are some of the lessons that you learned from your post-war grant making, or some of the funding that the U.S. government has provided, that are applicable to today's conflicts? I mean, we still have to, of course, address some of the legacies of the war in Southeast Asia, and we're all very dedicated to do that. But at the same time, we know that there's current conflicts that need to be addressed. So what are some of the lessons that you think could be applicable to addressing today's conflicts? Susan, do you want to start? You mentioned a few.
Yeah. Well, I think I mentioned this question of what's enough. I don't think you have to come up with a perfect answer of what's enough, but I don't think we did a good job in our conversations with people who are interested but a little reluctant to have what I was going to call bite-sized ideas, but big bite-sized ideas, not little tiny things. But I think we needed to sort of stepwise people through things. And I don't think we did as good a job of that as we could have. I do think there is a group of local foundations that now probably have Vietnamese Americans in their communities who have gained some power and gained some influence. And there are probably plenty of people who have, on the US side or the Vietnamese side, been injured by dioxin and these kinds of problems. And I think there could be some activism there, because these local foundations, community foundations in particular, but many local family foundations, they try to serve their communities. And I don't think these populations have come to them very much. I don't hear about it when I look at where their grants go. And so I think there's some, it's not sort of a lesson learned, but it really wasn't possible before. And I think that's now a new terrain that we could do more with. And I think as Tim was saying, just providing information, a lot of information to people who have decision-making power, and keeping at it over time, being the sort of, the annoying friend who just keeps coming back over and over again. That's really important, really important. And I do believe in all systems of government, there are good people. They may not be the ones that always stand out in front of it. They may not be what the politics are at the moment, but there are lots of good people. And I think beginning to develop those relationships now and work on them will pay off. I can actually imagine a case where if a couple of local or community foundations got engaged with their Vietnamese American people who wanted to work on this, and then went to a national foundation and said, look, there are 5 or 6 of us across the country who want to do this. I think that's a pretty interesting deal to offer a national foundation. Right now, I don't see the national foundation, the international, the big foundations going into it a whole lot, but I think they would be quite touched by a kind of movement of that kind.
Great, thanks. Karen or Tim, Terry, anything to add?
The only thing that I would add is what Susan just said about the fact that you have to have a long view. Senator Leahy and I had worked on these issues for 30 years, as have all of you. And you can't think that things are going to happen quickly. You have to start small. You have to build relationships, including with people in the country. The relationship between Lieutenant General Nguyen Chi Binh and Senator Leahy was absolutely critical to our ability to work hand in hand with Vietnam. And so those take time, and people need to understand that, it's a process of educating people, for example, here in the Congress. And that means coming back and finding ways to introduce them to people who they need to hear from. But over time, people become invested, and people begin to take some sense of ownership and see the value in it. And yet, too often people, at least here, think that, they do some one-off thing and that's enough. It doesn't work that way for real meaningful results for something like this.
Right.
If I could pick up on something that Susan Beresford was saying about local level Asian American philanthropies, which are beginning to emerge. The Luz Foundation some years ago made a couple of grants to support Hmong studies in Minnesota at Concordia College, Concordia University, and also in Wisconsin. And this was, I think, an example of how these refugee communities were organizing themselves and coming to the realization that they needed to keep their own history and culture alive. And so the Luz Foundation was able to help, get that launched. I don't honestly know where it stands now, but I hope and expect that it has continued to thrive with support from that own community. I have a concern also about education, as Tim mentions, for the next generation. We're 2 or 3 generations now removed from the war and from normalization of diplomatic relations. And so how do we convey this history? How do we explain to people why we are concerned, why they should be concerned, why this is in the interest of the United States? And I think the philanthropies and NGOs, other organizations particularly, need to look at how you can make use of social media, which is a double-edged sword, of course, but that's the reality. That's where this generation gets so much of their information. By the same token, it's so very important to document the legacies. So Hai Nguyen, who's based out of the Kennedy School now, has got an oral history project that he's been working on, interviewing Vietnamese, Cambodians, Laotians who participated in the war. And it's so important to do this while they still can. And Luz Foundation has fairly recently provided funding for that.
Yeah, I heard about that at the conference in Harvard earlier this month, and some of it is also being funded by a Vietnamese American who has a foundation. And there is a lot of engagement that is happening, particularly with the Vietnamese American community. Of course, they're the largest in the United States compared to the Lao or the Hmong or Khmer. So you see a lot of that. But it's been they've been getting more and more engaged with their homeland, either going back to work or to study, and many of them also getting involved in the war legacies issues. Of course, Legacies of War, one of our partners, is here at the War Legacies Working Group, have been very, very instrumental in getting the engagement of the Laotian American community in addressing and advocating for the issue of unexploded ordnance. So one of the things I in my trip recently, I was talking with the Vietnamese government and the Lao government about how they're developing and moving out of, either for the Lao case, the least developed country status in Vietnam, moving from into the middle income in the next few years. But as part of that, there's also a lot of reduction in funding that's coming from the bilateral donors, as well as some foundations who've move on to other areas. And in some cases, particularly I think in the Lao case, there hasn't been a lot of preparation for that transition that's going to be happening in the next short term. So what do you have any ideas of can be done to help ease this transition, to enable the domestic NGOs and some of the international NGO sectors to find the resources that they need to continue this work on it, not only on addressing unexploded ordnance and Agent Orange and other war legacy issues, but other issues as they further develop from a post-war area. What can foundations who've been engaged in this area for many years do to help encourage stability, some sustainability in for these organizations as donors leave the scene?
I guess I don't feel like I know enough about the resources they can turn to, but I think it may be useful to help people in these new emerging organizations see the patterns from other organizations' transitions, because foundations don't stay with things forever anyway. And so developing some information that helps people see ahead of time the kinds of resources they have to develop. But I don't feel I have enough on the ground experience now to know what that means. But certainly there's a history there that can help people see that something ahead that they may not see at the beginning. But others may know more about the resources on the ground.
Yeah, Susan, I think Susan Hammond, I think you're the best one to answer your own question. But I guess I'd like to raise a concern about the status and the future of Fulbright, because people like Min Kaufman and with Mennonite Central Committee and Tom Vallely played such an instrumental role in securing congressional funding. But then with the loss of USAID funding, which has been crucial to Fulbright, what is the future? I mean, it doesn't seem to me from a distance that American philanthropy will be able to step into that gap in a significant way.
Tim, do you have any updates on what's happening in that sector?
I don't, because the whole appropriations process is so paralyzed right now. But I also think that there are two things. One is, I would not assume that there will not be continued interest here in supporting both Fulbright scholars and Fulbright University in Vietnam. Again, a lot of the need is educating people here about why this matters to the United States and why it matters to the relationship between the United States and Vietnam. And if people hear that, I think they will understand it. It's not a difficult case to make. The other thing, though, is that, and Susan has alluded to this, U.S. assistance is not forever. And Vietnam, and to a lesser but increasing extent Cambodia, are becoming more capable of addressing these needs themselves. There are, many billionaires in Vietnam today. So, there needs to be a transition. And who better than themselves to address these issues, which, in many ways they're best at doing. But at the same time, there's more to this, and that is the need to use these collaborative types of programs to further the larger relationship. And so it's not just about money. And I think that, can easily be shown to understand that. And so while, I can't speak with certainty about the future of Fulbright in Vietnam, there's clearly a case to be made for it, and it's incumbent on all of us to make that case.
Tim, you mentioned, sorry.
Including, I should say, the Vietnamese themselves. And in the case of programs in Laos, the Laotians themselves. The Laotians, have become, much more from the early days, collaborative and willing to work with us, but they have a long way to go. It takes inordinate amounts of time to get any decision out of that government, including if it's for some purpose to help their own people. So that's another part of this whole equation that, is a work in progress.
I had one thought also about the emerging philanthropists in the region. If you look at patterns of philanthropy around the world, when new philanthropy appears, the most typical thing is that rich people put money in their own hometown. They put money in respected institutions in the community because that gives them prestige and they care about those institutions. And that's a very typical pattern. But after a while, people often not only do that, but then reach out to things that are more complex to deal with and more sensitive. And in my files in philanthropy from that region that I've shown that transition, and some of them that might have been courageous enough right at the start to do something that's not so typical of the beginning philanthropy pattern, would be useful because I think people learn from example. And I've been a consultant in philanthropy now and then, and I have a few foundations do very unusual things. And I find when I describe it, people say, well, I never even thought I could do that. That's really interesting. One guy said it changed completely how he thought about it. So I think maybe some profiles of these, the best of the emerging philanthropies would be good.
Just to echo what Susan has just said, Peter Geithner at Ford Foundation and in collaboration with the Asia Foundation had a consortium on just this issue, the development and the study of philanthropy in Asia. And at that point, of course, it did not include much on Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, but it's certainly worth going back and looking at the record of those dialogues, those meetings in Philippines and elsewhere. Also, the East-West Center for years has been working on the same project, on the same topic.
Yeah, and I know that Madam Ning in Ho Chi Minh City has been also very much working on this issue, engaging and starting discussions amongst on developing philanthropy in a way that can be more sustainable and provide support to local Vietnamese entities. I just want to add on to something that Tim, one of the questions that came in was how many, who should we, because now we don't have Senator Leahy, sadly, in Congress, but as you mentioned, many others are there and interested in these issues. I know Senator Merkley has visited Vietnam a few years ago and has been very supportive of these issues, as is, I believe, Senator Van Hollen and many others. But who else would you recommend put sort of at the top of the list of those of us who are advocating on these issues should make an opportunity to visit?
Well, let me answer that, but also say that there are people who we don't know if they would be interested, but who very well might be if they knew enough to understand why they should care. I mean, frankly, as I said at the outset, we didn't know when we first started really what needed to be done or what could be done. So in many ways, we were in the same situation as some people here today. The difference, and Terry mentioned this, is that we lived through the war, period. And the challenge I find that is perhaps the biggest is explaining to people who are not old enough to remember that time why they should still care about it. I think it's not a difficult case to make because the relationship with these countries is changing in ways that is very important to the United States, but but they need it to be explained to them. Um, Now, in terms of members of Congress, both Alaskan senators, certainly. You mentioned Merkley and Van Hollen. Others who traveled there with us are Senator Kaine of Virginia, Senator Hirono of Hawaii. There are some House members. There are a number of people that have either been to Vietnam. So obviously, Senator Welch, who has an interest in continuing Senator Leahy's legacy to the extent that he can contribute. But there are more than that, and I can certainly, help in making connections with Senate offices. But some of them I don't know because we don't know if they would be interested. You have to strike out and make the effort. The best way, obviously, is if veterans groups or if humanitarian organizations from their state who care about this, or foundations, ask to meet with them and explain what they're doing and why that member of Congress should care enough to find ways to support this in Washington.
Yeah, and again, that goes back to a lot of the work that the Luce Foundation has been doing with educating Americans about Asia and about this region. Is many of them who that they learn about it first at their university level because there's a special course in Vietnamese studies or something on the campus that we don't, what American students today don't really learn about the war in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia in their high school education. A few do, but for the most part, it's something you take as a special course at the university. And thanks to, in great part, to a lot of the work of Luce, those courses exist, those professors exist, and so it's very vital. Courtney, I see that you've popped up on the screen. Are there some other questions in the Q&A that we need to address? Or I see that Andrew Wells-Dang is on here too, so he may have questions that he wants to ask before we move on to his final remarks in a bit.
Well, I'll just jump in very briefly. So I do have one question and I'll bring it back, but I'll just comment. I think I'm the only one on this panel who was born long after the war ended. And so I am part of that generation, as are many I know in the audience for today's call, that did not live through the war, that have, an indirect personal connection to it through history. And I will just sort of reinforce what Terry and others have said too about education being so crucial in this space, because when I was in high school, which admittedly now is 20 years ago, so it's probably changed since then, but it was, we did cover the war in Vietnam, but it was a fairly brief period, and it was treated as past. This was a war, it's in the past, this issue has passed. But as we know, the past has not truly passed. The past continues with us. And that element, I think, is perhaps left out of conversation, even for those who do get exposure to this, to understand how this has repercussions that are ongoing today. And I think especially, again, given that, the Vietnam War, as we call it here in the States, it wasn't my war. The war I grew up with was in Iraq and in Afghanistan, but finding ways to draw comparisons and links and lessons learned from experience addressing the long repercussions in Southeast Asia. And are there ways that could be applied to conflict that people are living through and seeing? And then maybe a very valuable angle to approach this through, because it gives that personal connection. And that's how people get connected to these issues. At the same time, I think Luce and others have been crucial, particularly for smaller universities and smaller educational institutions, in supporting initiatives on this, because often when you talk to stakeholders who are talking about Asia, they're talking about China, they're talking about Japan. You don't necessarily get that truly, regional perspective on Southeast Asia, or that bigger picture regional understanding. So I do think continuing to expand those types of engagements, not just in universities, but even at lower levels, is also quite crucial. So that's just sort of my quick 2 cents in there. I think there are a number of folks in the audience today who are also from my generation, and perhaps welcome them to share them in the Q&A forum. We did have one question that I'll share into the chat, just talking about those next set of funders, to see if those on the call are familiar with it. But one of our attendees has asked if anyone has thoughts about the Asia Venture Philanthropy Forum, which to my knowledge is sort of a regional forum for mostly regionally based philanthropies that are looking for programming to support. So, I'm not sure if anyone on the call is familiar with that, but do you see opportunities for matchmaking in trying to reach groups that might have money available and might have interest, but may not have found the right passion project or type of engagement to support? So I welcome anyone to answer that, and then I'm happy to let Andrew chime in if he has thoughts as well.
Before we go to Andrew, I have a question for Ambassador Stewart. Today, actually, I think happening right about now is the hearing in the Senate for the new ambassador designee to Vietnam, Jennifer Wicks McNamara. So my question is, you may not want to answer this, but as you were, before you did your first postings to Laos, what were some of the things that you wish you had studied or focused on or learned before you set foot in that you're posting there, that maybe that we, as we once hopefully she is confirmed, as we begin to engage with her, that we can help educate her and share with her. Any thoughts?
Well, the first time they sent me to Laos, they did it on very short notice. So besides having 9 weeks of Lao training, I think there was a lot I could have learned, but about that. I mean, in just the whole history of the war and what went on. And in my generation, high school history classes stopped at World War II, so we never got to the Vietnam War. But so that kind of background. Now, Jennifer, who I know, I'm sure is being well briefed, but it's hard to really understand the impact, the lingering impact of the things we've been talking about today, the Agent Orange and the UXO and such, until you've been there. So I think anything that we can do to explain both the historical context and how this has been an ongoing issue and is still important, and how it does continue to contribute to the relationship, even though in the case of Vietnam, we've expanded, even somewhat to Laos too, but we've expanded into economics and trade, and other things have become become priorities. And I guess one of my concerns would be that as the embassy in the U.S. government faces an expanding horizon and more opportunities, then more priorities begin to compete with the ones that we're interested in right now. So to show that connection and how these continue to be issues that'll help develop the relationship. I would certainly echo some of I think Tim and touched on this and others, that it helps if the host governments also will continue to push on these issues. And Laos is generally not as advanced in some of these approaches as Vietnam is. But I think now that I'm now in this new role on a board of a nonprofit, non-government organization myself, it's very interesting to me to hear these comments about foundations and founders, and I hope to follow up on this Asia joint venture group, which I had not heard about, because the idea of how do you reach out to, how do you get more support, more interest, and I think these kinds of ideas, the ideas of how the diaspora, the Lao Americans or Vietnamese Americans themselves might now be moving into this area as donors and philanthropists, is an overall thing. So I guess what I would come back to what Ambassador Designate Wicks and other ambassadors going out will be useful. As I say, the history, the connections of these particular issues, a good deal of introduction also to what the communities here in America, the Lao American and Vietnamese American, Cambodian American communities are doing and all. That was an area that I did not do as much outreach to that as I should have probably as ambassador. And I think looking back, that would be something to work on.
Susan, one other thought, the sooner an ambassador can get out and visit with families affected by Agent Orange and these other things, because it was very hard to get people to do that in the beginning. And once you see a couple of families and see how complicated, and now it's a couple of generations out, you're going to see how long lasting and profound this effect of dioxin is. And so if we can encourage new people who come, ambassadors and everybody else, to get out and see families, I think Senator Leahy was probably the first elected official to visit a family. Really important.
Yeah, I would really agree with that. And I think impressing on her that while the relationship is changing a lot, that some things are remaining the same. And those are things that are really important to the relationship. And it's incumbent on the government of Vietnam and others in Vietnam and all of us to explain that even though these are issues that date from the wartime, they are still relevant today and relevant to the relationship and the way that we and the Vietnamese and Laotians and Cambodians have been able to solve other problems is because of the work that we've done and need to continue to do on these humanitarian issues.
So I'll jump in. I think we've got time for one more question before we give Andrew his closing remarks. And I'll just highlight that, the language investments came up once or twice, and I think it is valuable to think of this not just as assistance, but partnership on these issues is an investment that pays dividends in the long run for the U.S. relationship with the region. We had one final question from the audience that I think I would welcome a round robin of quick thoughts on before we turn to Andrew. And some of you hinted at this, but one of our attendees asks, what would you encourage younger advocates and students specifically to focus on if they want to contribute meaningfully to reconciliation work over the long term? So looking back at your experience and looking at the needs and gaps that some of you have highlighted. So I'll turn things over to you all to wrap that up. And then Andrew, I'll let you close things out.
If I could just say one thing, it would be please find a way to get to the region, to visit these countries and to see this is not just about history or legacy of the war, as important as that is, but it's about what's going on in these dynamic societies, particularly in Vietnam, and to have that firsthand appreciation. The network consortium of liberal arts colleges has provided funding, a lot of it from Freeman Foundation over the years, to send delegations of students to the region, and it is transformative.
I would encourage young people to, as they feel a concern for what they see and know, to try and connect it to American values and to the values of their own country, Vietnam, whatever. I think to be a forceful advocate from both a knowledge base and a value base. And too often, I think these arguments come across as sort of a fix-it instead of something that is deeply important to the political structure and the political values of whatever country is involved. And also, someone young today, 10 years from now, they're going to be an important voting adult, a professional or a worker of some sort. They have power. And so I think you're right, who asked the question, to focus on the building over time. Yeah. Tim made it takes a long time. But connecting it to the values of your nation is as important as connecting it to your personal values. Those two things should come together.
I can't improve on any of that.
Right. So if there isn't anything more to discuss on that question, as Courtney said, it's my role to sum up and look to the future on the issues that we've discussed today. I'd like to thank all of our panelists and Susan and Courtney for moderating, and from the audience. So we've heard today about war legacy programs, their history, current status, what's the role of philanthropy, and how we can get more people involved in these questions. So I'd like to take each of those briefly. We all agree there's a need to continue both the physical war legacy programs that are going on in Vietnam and have been in Laos and Cambodia, and also the social and cultural exchange and reconciliation programs, educational work, advocacy, and so on, which also the panelists and funders have been doing. And a question came up of what would an end state look like, right? How long does this work need to go on? I think we can answer that for some of the physical war legacies. So the dioxin cleanup at Bien Hoa Air Base now is ongoing. It has an end date. At some point, it will be finished if all of the funding continues to go for it. The victim side disability and health of people affected by Agent Orange is much more challenging because that's a large group of people spread all over Vietnam and some in Laos. And that funding has not been maintained 100% by the current administration. So I think there's a challenge for funding, but also just to reach people in need, to build capacity in Vietnam and in Laos to continue to care for and support those families. That will take a lot more time and effort. But I think there is a point where we could see that. So for now, like the first generation of people exposed during and after the war are still living. The second and third and following generations are also affected, but not in as large numbers. And so there is over time, decline to some extent in the number of people affected. And that's also true for UXO and landmine survivors and casualties. As Ambassador Stewart and others mentioned, there's been a decline in the number of casualties and incidents in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam, but there are still some occurring, right? So it won't be a point where every single bomb is taken out of the ground, but we can, I think, envision a future, not so many years from now, where there's not a great threat of further casualties. We've mentioned the issue of missing and unidentified persons from the war, which is something that I'm working on now. And that's also a physical war legacy issue that will take more time to find answers for families. Families from all the countries have been waiting for decades to find out what happened to their loved ones, and if possible, to get remains returned to them. That won't be possible in every case because a lot of time has gone by, but there's still a lot of work going on with that, which is being supported by the US government and also with backing from the governments in the region. So on the role of philanthropy, we've heard that philanthropies can innovate. They have flexibility. They can be creative and start new things. And that's needed, I think, now more than ever. There's also a role for philanthropies and nonprofits to advocate and hold governments accountable, and to, in some cases, take up some activities that government isn't doing or is not continuing for now. That's perhaps a temporary thing. I don't think there's any way to replace a USAID-sized hole in foreign assistance right now, for instance. But there are things that private foundations and non-government donors can do to make sure a lot of the progress that's been made with US government support does continue in the coming years. And finally, in getting others involved. We've talked about veterans, diaspora communities, and young people. And just to say a few things about each of those, with the MIA and missing persons initiatives, veterans and families of the missing from all sides are coming together to work together on that. And I think there's a growing support from different veteran service organizations to do that also. On the side of the diaspora, I recently had the chance to attend the Vietnamese American Foundation's event in Houston. They are starting a new effort to maintain and preserve the former South Vietnamese military cemetery near Bien Hoa, outside of Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. So this is a diaspora contributes to accounting and reconciliation from all sides. And finally, with young people, there's obviously a great value, as has been said, in travel and first-hand experience of Southeast Asia, and vice versa for Southeast Asians to experience the US. There's also a lot we can do online that can reach many more people at lower cost. And happy to share that the youth and young professionals dialogues that I and my colleagues at the U.S. Institute of Peace were working on over the last several years are continuing in 2026. And we're doing this together with Peace Trees Vietnam, who's on the call today, and a new Southeast Asia Peace Institute, which some of my colleagues and some diaspora communities from the region have started. So I'll put that registration form in the chat. It's open to students and young professionals between ages of 18 and 35 from the US, as well as Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. So those are some things that are going on. I know there's a lot more that needs to be done. Again, like to thank everyone for your interest, and thanks again to the Stimson Center for being a place that brings people together to share about all these issues. Wish you all a great day.